Addictions and compulsive behaviors are some of the most destructive and biggest obstacles that stand in the way of fulfilling lives and self actualizing development. Today, I'm going to explain to you from my personal experience and from the research I've done what the addictive process entails, how we can kind of get caught up in that vicious cycle. Then I'll move into my own experience with this and how we can overcome it and sort of transmute that energy towards a higher expression. And this is something which I've been dealing with to some extent in the last couple of weeks as well. I'm always going to keep it 100 with you guys and use my own experience and my own reflections to try to be of service and provide a valuable message here. So let's start out with what is the addiction process. And actually, I'm going to just pull out sort of a good definition or a good depiction of it from this book here because I think it explains it really well. This book is called The Primal Wound by John Furman and Ann Gila, and it's by far one of the best books on addiction and the process of kind of overcoming that through self-realization that I've read. So let me get into the quote here. Addiction, this is the quoting from the book now. Addiction embodies a powerful and destructive vicious circle in which we continually cycle through negative and positive modes of being. In abusive relationships, we are seduced by moments of peace and love and then are plunged into despair by the next round of abuse. In substance abuse, we feel the joy and well-being of the intoxication, but then the remorse and self-loathing of the morning after. Here's the closed system, the vicious circle of the addictive process. And then there's a diagram here. Hopefully you guys can see this decently well. But it's kind of just a vicious loop there. For example, with the alcoholism, there's the primal wound of non-being that was the origins of addiction. It originated from us not receiving good enough empathic mirroring in childhood, essentially. But that leads to a feeling of powerlessness, which leads into alcoholism, which gives you a feeling of power, but then you lose that, so you feel powerless without it. It's that typical vicious circle of addiction. It's a downward spiral that you get caught in because it's a closed loop, and what can happen with substance abuse, for example, is, and something that has happened to me various times, like my experience with it is with smoking weed. That was the substance that I've been addicted to and been struggling with. Not, on and off over the last several years. More so even in previous years, but I kind of fell back into that recently, and that has given me a lot of insight into how this works, because it's a very slippery slope. We may think that we have overcome a certain addiction, or that we haven't done it in such a time that, okay, now I can go back. This is the way the ego tries to trick you. Now I could go back into smoking weed and do it with self-control and just have it be a self-regulating mechanism rather than a compulsive mechanism. And no doubt, that certainly works for a lot of people. And, if that's what gets them through, or if that's just a way for them to relax and enjoy themselves, more power to them. But for me, what it was is, let me think about, how I want to explain this. First, let me say that when you're going back, if you're in an addiction cycle right now, if you're going back into a cycle of addiction, awareness of exactly what's going on somatically and psychologically is really going to help you overcome that in the future and come to the insights and understanding you need to be better prepared to tackle that in the future. If you can, even while in the grips of the addiction process, even if you just have that strong compulsion to do it, to notice what's going on somatically and psychologically so that you know what you're up against. Because most of the times it's unconscious. When we start out, we first fall into these patterns. It's just we're grasping onto anything we can to feel safe, to regulate our nervous system because we were wounded and traumatized. And this was the response we went to, and it was a reasonable response. And, you know, these things, whether it was alcoholism or compulsive seeking of relationships, whatever the addiction is, excessively playing video games, or, you know, even the more subtle addictions of just thinking all the time, incessantly talking to oneself. All of these were strategies we developed to cope with undesirable circumstances in our lives. And so don't beat yourself up for falling into the addiction. What's required is not a sort of, like, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but what's required is not beating yourself up more and like scrutinizing yourself and judging yourself and hating yourself. That's only going to continue that vicious circle. What's required is coming to a place of self-love to where you love all parts of yourself, and then building awareness of why it was that you fell into that addiction in the first place and why you continue to do it in the present moment and what it does for you. So with that being said, now going back to my experience, this is the experience I've had these past couple weeks because, you know, a friend came and stayed at my house and they brought some weed with them, and it was just happened to so be 420, the day everybody loves smoking weed, that I had done, you know, for the past many years, essentially, you know. So yeah, I got into smoking a little bit, and I noticed it genuinely has a soothing effect on the nervous system. You know, I noticed why it was that I like to do this. It genuinely even dissolves tension in the body that I'm holding on to, dissolves tension in the mind, and lets me go into that peaceful state. And that was okay for the first week or whatever. You know, I was just smoking here and there off when my friend had it. And I also went with my friends to see a baseball game. And it was all okay. You know, the part that wasn't okay was that you guys might have seen in my previous videos, I committed to myself that I wanted to maintain sobriety, and I broke that commitment. So breaking commitments to yourself, that's not a sort of process. That's not a thing we want to do. But overall, I was still getting work done, and like it was all going fine. But then just this last week, you know, I went and picked up some weed myself just because I felt I didn't have it and my friend had left, and I literally felt in my body the craving to have it. And I was like, you know what, like if I can just like have this and just do a little bit at night. But what it turned into was me just like this week, like for 3 days straight, essentially just being high all day, smoking weed all day. Because that old coping mechanism came back online, right? But bringing that increased level of awareness that I've cultivated through spiritual practice and meditation and reading various high quality books like this book, The Primal Wound, bringing that awareness to the process, I feel like has helped over time. You know, even the previous times that I've fallen back into this, I was a little more aware each time. And that has now brought me to a place where I feel like I'm prepared to give that up and to just say no and make that firm no that I'm not doing this, because it's not worth it for me to even take the chance to smoke some weed knowing that the old neural firing and pathways and the old, you know, sort of coping mechanism, addiction pattern, that vicious cycle in the mind is already imprinted in the brain from the previous years when I had been addicted to this substance. So it's not worth, for me, it's better to just stay away from that completely. Somebody else may be able to have self-control, but for me, I just can't because of my history with the substance. So it's important to have that distinction as well, right? to know yourself, to know that, okay, maybe I just need to outwardly renounce this thing and just say no to it. There's an inward renunciation, there's outward renunciation. Where we ultimately want to get to is inward renunciation, to where we don't even want, basically inward renunciation is we don't even want to do it anymore. That's what it really is. We've seen a higher reality. We've grown to embody and we've basically grown to find new ways of cultivating joy and safety and love in our lives in a healthy way instead of in a compulsive addiction process. So that can make us not even want to do those addictions anymore. And I do think even in the past several months, a large part of myself was there, but there was one or two sub-personalities. There was some wounded inner adolescent that still wanted to do this and just wanted to run away because, another book I've been reading is called Complex PTSD. It's a pretty heavy book, but, I kind of realized that I was a flight type, and through things like playing a lot of video games, smoking a lot of weed, I would run away from my problems and dissociate into those activities. And just building that awareness can help me not to do that in the future, to realize what's going on in the moment when it is happening, so I can better attack that moving forward. So that's why, inner work in these areas is so important. But something I wanted to bring into that I don't think I've heard too many people talk about is that when you start to do this inner work, or just start to do a lot of introspection, start to elevate your consciousness, and now you're noticing all these little different parts of yourself, and maybe you're doing some journaling, you're reading some books, and you're going into old wounding, old trauma, and you're kind of opening that up and unpacking it, it can become overwhelming. And opening up that old wound can also bring to the surface of your consciousness those old coping mechanisms which you use to deal with it. So, I think it's just important to be aware of that, and to develop the capacity to, okay, I can just sit here, I can just go on a walk, I can sit with this compulsion and not act upon it, and that'll go away. I can meditate, to have tools in your toolbox that you can use to regulate yourself in a more healthy way as you're doing the really deep inner work. But as you continue to do that inner work, you'll start to have that conversation with the wounded part of yourself, with the one who wants to engage in that compulsive process, and sort of integrate that in a more healthy way is what will happen over time. So one more thing I wanted to touch upon is, right, that the addiction process is like a spiraling down. But with the awareness that you're bringing to it, it's almost a regression in service of transcendence. Look at it that way. If you're currently caught up in some sort of addiction and you can't stop yourself from doing it, the greatest way to be able to overcome that addiction is through awareness and through the elevation of your consciousness. Because even while you're in that, you may have been spiraling up for a while, something happened, now you're kind of spiraling down. It can be a regression in the service of transcendence if you bring that awareness and that curiosity to the process to truly understand somatically and psychologically why you're doing what you're doing, and what needs you need to meet within yourself so that you don't have to do that anymore. How you can sort of, and what healing work you need to do on yourself so that that compulsive complex doesn't take over your psyche. And as you elevate your consciousness and awareness, basically what you'll find is that, what are we looking for in all these addictions? We're looking for love, we're looking for joy, we're looking for things that we didn't receive in childhood. All these needs can be met through spiritual living and through loving God. When you come into attunement with God's love through meditation, through deep spiritual practice over time, that becomes a place where you can go to get your needs met, to feel that love within you. And that's, what I've done over these past several years. That's why I haven't, for many months, I wasn't smoking weed or anything. I just happened to fall into it, and that's fine, because ultimately it was a regression in the service of transcendence. And actually what I ended up doing yesterday was throwing away all of my weed paraphernalia, my bong, my tray, my grinder, everything completely. I just threw it away. And I think that was just a good symbolic gesture to realize. And then I kind of just went on a hike and thought about some stuff, to realize that just throwing it away and just making that small gesture is something I could do to really like say no and make that soul level decision within myself of just saying, no, I'm not going to do this. Because I have so many, and noticing the contrast of just how much better I'm feeling when I'm recording these YouTube videos, when I'm writing. Earlier this year, I went and stayed 10 days at an ashram and was just so filled with joy and love over that time of just devoting my entire attention towards God and to a higher spiritual reality. And noticing the contrast, because how much better that was than these last 10 days of smoking weed and kind of just falling into that lethargic, empty state of mind and state of being. Noticing that contrast with your increased awareness it just doesn't make sense anymore. Why are you going to go smoke weed or do something that's going to lower your vibration, lower your frequency, when being in tune with a higher reality is just so much more blissful? And of course, there's challenges that are associated with that. It does require, elevating, just growing as a person, self-actualizing, the process of self-realization. It requires putting in an immense amount of effort to refine my knowledge, reading the books, doing the introspection, doing the inner work, working on marketing my spiritual group. There's a lot that goes into it, and it requires effort. The other tempting thing about addiction and kind of falling into that lethargy is, it's easier in a sense. It doesn't require as much effort. But when you put that effort in, that's where you're going to find that fulfillment. And it becomes easier because you know that you love doing what you're doing. You enjoy it. You gain energy from it. Over time, it actually becomes easier because it's very hard to live in that state of addiction when that self-loathing just kind of compounds and you're stuck in that vicious circle. It's very difficult to live in that headspace. So yeah, like just start spiraling up. Because also once you start, if you start building a spiritual practice, meditation, just spiritual living, keeping God and keeping a higher reality in your mind and in your sort of divine purpose for why you're here on this earth, to somehow make a positive difference, to somehow elevate your level of consciousness and your soul. That's very important. And that's where purpose comes into this, right? Because that energy that was erected towards the addiction process, instead that creative energy that's now welling up with inside of you, you don't want to let that go into some destructive process. You want to have identified, I made a video about life purpose, go see that if you want. You want to identify your life purpose and put your energy towards that creative pursuit. That's also what's really going to help you overcome addiction, is applying your energy in a productive manner. And you're just going to feel so much better. You're going to notice the contrast of how much better and more fulfilled and authentic you feel within yourself as you do this, right? Let me just think if there's anything else. If you want help overcoming your addictions and above all, grounding yourself in a spiritual lifestyle and a spiritual practice, look into my spiritual fellowship group. I've just started a spiritual fellowship group where the main focus is essentially on helping you build a consistent spiritual practice. But, and we'll do things like read from the Bible and take inspiration from that, read from various spiritual texts. We'll start out each session with a meditation, and we'll also have a kind of satsang Q&A where we can go into anything. And I'm also very willing to go into the psychological side of things as well. If that sounds interesting to you, this is the cheapest it'll ever be to work with me. Check the link in the description, reach out to me on Instagram or Substack. Those will be in the description. I'd love to work with you. And, but regardless, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope that somehow this video helped you introspect and you can take something away from this to overcome that compulsive process and align yourself with where your higher self wants you to be, right? Yeah, so please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.